Okay, yeah, there we go. That should be on. And I got back there and got the stream started for the class. And the bell just rang, so we're all ready to go now. Give everybody a minute to kind of get situated, and I know we'll have some more come in as we get going. We're in Job, of course, continuing our study of that book. We're in chapter 32 today. Actually, we'll be in 32 and 33 at least. If we have time, we'll get into 34 as well. But this is a new section with a new speaker, a fellow named Elihu. If you remember, and I'll bring this up again. Let's see how far down I have to get here to get this to work. Come on, I know it works. I already tested it out. Actually, I think I know why it may not be working. I don't have anybody in there right now, so hold on. I'll be right back. There we go. So I'd taken it out of one program and forgot to start this one back up. It's always something, right? Anyway, just to remind us here of the overall shape of the book, we know what we've looked at those last few weeks after that dialogue back and forth between Job and his friends when they're trying to figure out, Job is trying to figure out what the reason behind all of his suffering is. And his friends repeatedly come down with increasing intensity on this doctrine of retribution. That is, Job is suffering greatly, so therefore he must be a great sinner, because that's the only thing that their worldview allows. And so the only consolation they can offer him is, you need to repent. You need to get right with God. Job, meanwhile, says that no, that doesn't fit his experience. And so he increasingly realizes that the friends don't have anything to offer him, that if he's going to get answers, they're only going to come from God. And that's what results in what we've looked at the last couple of weeks, this avowal of innocence in chapters 29 through 31, where Job, first of all, he talks about the good old days. Then he laments his present experience in contrast to that. This is the way it was. I was healthy and I was prosperous and I was blessed with a happy family and I was respected in the community, but now I've lost all of that and I am the subject of ridicule from this worthless rabble. And then in chapter 31, which we looked at last week, that sort of climax of that avowal of innocence where he actually takes an oath, and his friends have accused him in some cases of specific sins. In other cases, they've just implied that he's committed particular sins. But at any rate, if you remember, he goes through and he swears that he has not committed a number of specific sins. And then he signs his name at the end of it, so to speak. And the whole point of that is it's drawing on ancient legal customs, and the idea is if someone goes before the court and they swear like this that they're innocent, then their accuser has to face them. And in his thinking, his accuser is God. He's the one behind all of his pain, all of his suffering. Alternatively, he's called down all these curses in the things that he's sworn, if you recall that. That is, he says, I haven't done this, and if I'm lying, may whatever bad consequence happen to me. May his wife go to another man. May his shoulder blade fall out of his socket, things like that. And if he's guilty, then the thinking is God will curse him, just like he's said. But if he's innocent, he wants God to come and to speak to him. But if God doesn't appear directly and give him an answer, at the least, if he doesn't activate all those curses, well, that means publicly Job's vindicated. Nobody's going to think he's guilty of all these sins anymore because God's let it pass without these negative consequences taking place. So I remind us of all that because that is so brazen, so audacious for him to stand up boldly like that it leaves his friends speechless. they don't have anything to say for the rest of the book. They probably realize, for one thing, that this guy is hopeless. They are never going to budge him from his view of his own innocence. There's nothing that they could say at this point that will convince him. I think also they're probably scared, terrified even, because they're just sort of waiting there for God to answer. This leaves us in tension here, and we have that pretty climactic statement at the end of chapter 31, the words of Job are ended, and we're just waiting now for the other shoe to drop. What's going to happen here? So we're waiting for God to answer, but God remains silent. He doesn't speak here yet. And so this young man, Elihu, takes advantage of this silence to speak for the first time. He feels an extreme need to defend God's honor, and he's convinced that he'll be the one to persuade Job where all of his friends have failed here. Now, what we're going to see, it really comes out in this first speech, I think, but you see it in all of them. His style is verbose, he is wordy, he is repetitive. It's overly apologetic. He's somewhat arrogant. At least he comes across that way a good bit. And I think if waiting for God here, when Job's called down all these curses, if waiting for God is this sort of tension-filled, even terror-filled time, he serves as almost comic relief here for the author, at least. I'm talking about from the inspired author who shapes this book. Elihu sort of breaks the tension here. He gives us a moment to take a breath before God comes and speaks to us. So after making a lengthy apology, we'll read that here, that is a defense for his speaking, he delivers 4 speeches, 4 discourses. And unlike with Job and his friends, where a friend would speak and then Job would answer in turn, all 4 of these are unanswered. He just speaks 4 speeches straight through. And his thesis in all these, it's essentially twofold. One is God might punish a person, he might cause a person to suffer so that they learn from the error of their ways. That is, suffering can be a form of discipline, of trying to get you back on the right path, sort of a wake-up call. And then secondly, that God governs justly without exception. You can't ever accuse God of being unjust. So his approach is close to that of Job's 3 friends. Remember the 3 friends? Worldview, it's rooted, again, just to remind you, those of you who walked in later, in this doctrine of retribution or double retribution. That is, that the righteous prosper without exception, the wicked are punished without exception. And so, because Job's suffering, he must be a great sinner. That's their worldview. And Elihu's approach is close to that. But he doesn't assume that all suffering is a punishment for past sins. And that's an important difference. Somebody might suffer, misfortune might come upon them as a sort of warning, as a sort of shot across the bow for an error that they're engaged in. And so in that sense, suffering could be a manifestation not of God's wrath, but of his mercy, because he's trying to warn you from potentially worse consequences that would befall if you persist in that error. And so he exhorts Job, you need to humble yourself, you need to seek after God. In Elihu's view, it's the fact that Job is questioning God and that he's demanding that God answer him, that's the real problem here. That's his real answer. So, in fact, what he essentially argues, and this is where he gets really off track, is that in questioning God, Job is exalting himself and he's elevating himself above God, which I don't think he's doing, and in the end, God seems to vindicate him of that. But the upshot of this is, Elihu's view is that Job is not so much suffering because he sinned, but rather now he's sinning because he suffered. That is, his sin is coming now in his questioning God, and he needs to understand that his suffering could come for other reasons. So Elihu's answer isn't quite right because I think he misunderstands Job. He doesn't have the attitude quite right. Job doesn't claim that he's completely innocent, that he's sinless. Job doesn't claim that God's unjust, because in fact Job is trusting in God's justice to see him through this. But with all that said, Elihu does give us a better answer than the friends. There's progress here. He does make an important contribution towards how a person, a righteous person, should respond to suffering. And beyond that, the fact that we have him speaking here after Job's oath of innocence, then Elihu gives these 4 speeches, and only then does God speak. That reinforces God's sovereignty, because if we take this out, and if God were to speak immediately, if Job swears his oath and then God speaks out of the whirlwind, well, then it almost feels like Job forced his hand, doesn't it? That God was compelled to speak because Job swore this oath, and so God must answer, and that makes it, in a sense, almost like Job is at least as powerful, perhaps more powerful than God. But the fact that God waits, that he remains silent here, indicates that the fact that he speaks to Job is his choice. It's his sovereign decision. He's not compelled to do that. He does that again out of mercy, out of love for Job. God keeps all the initiative here with himself. And in fact, that's actually the sort of thing that Elihu will point out in his speeches, especially as we get towards the end. We won't see next week. We'll wrap up Elihu. And we'll see there that the last couple of his speeches start to sound more and more like what God has to say about himself. So all that's to say, we might be tempted, if we're going through the book, to think that these are a little bit anticlimactic, right? Because just like the friends, just like the Job, we're waiting for God to speak too, and now we've got, who is this guy that suddenly decides he's the one that needs to say something here? But his message at least points us in the right direction. It prepares us for God, even if it's imperfect. And I think it's notable, if you get to the end of the book, you'll notice that God says about Job that, and about his friends, that the 3 friends have spoken wrongly of God, unlike my servant Job. Elihu isn't included in that condemnation, which points us to the fact that even if his answer isn't quite right, it's not wrong like that of the friends was either. And I think even when you look at the speeches here, again, because we might be tempted to think that this is unimportant, when you think about the way it fits into the book and the comparison to these others, we shouldn't overlook it in the whole shape here, his role among the speakers. He delivers 4 speeches, which is 1 more than any of the comforters. They all deliver 3, except for Zophar. He only delivers 1. But these several consecutive chapters, 6 chapters here, it's a lot of material. This is longer than 12 Old Testament books. It's longer than 17 of the 27 New Testament books. This is a lot here. So all that's to say, we should pay attention to what he has to say. And also, because that's so long, we're not going to get through all this today, obviously. I hope maybe we're going to get at least through this first speech today. I hope we'll get through the second one, and then we'll get through the next 2 next week. It's possible it'll take us 3 weeks. We'll just see if we can get through both of these first 2 today. But at any rate, we're introduced to Elihu at the beginning of chapter 2, verses 1 through 5, where we have a prose section here. That is, most of Job, is poetry. The first 2 chapters are prose. The very end of the book, the last few verses of chapter 42, the epilogue, those are prose. Most of the rest of the book is poetry. But this is the first time we've heard about Elihu. We weren't introduced to him in the prologue the way that we were to all the other characters. So we have this little prose interlude in chapter 32, verses 1 through 5, the first one since back in the prologue. But compared to what we read in the prologue, which is really carefully constructed, really tight, really concise, this is a long and wordy intro to this guy, which I think foreshadows the style we're going to see him use in his speaking. Let's just read it here. So these 3 men ceased to answer Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. Then Elihu, the son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned with anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God. He burned with anger also at Job's three friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these three men, he burned with anger. Hey, did you catch that Elihu's angry? He burned with anger over and over again. That's what we mean, that verbose, repetitive style. The friends have given up because they can't convince Job. He was righteous in his own eyes, as it says there, and I think you might even see an indication of that gulf that exists between them. The first time they're introduced, back in chapter 2, verse 11, they're called as three friends. Now they're just called these three men, which I think is just a little subtle nod to the fact that they're not, they don't have that strong relationship that they had before. But Elihu is then introduced in this traditional style. We got his full genealogy here, his family, his tribe, his clan. He's a young guy, so he doesn't have any accomplishments of his own to recommend him. This is all rooted in his background here. But some of these names might be significant. The name Elihu means, he is my God. It's similar to the name Elijah, which means Yahweh is my God. It's just we don't have that Yah there. We have the El. El is my God. Likewise, his father's name, Barachel, that means God has blessed, or it could even be an imperative, bless, O God. And even though Job is written in a non-Jewish, a non-Hebrew setting, Job isn't a Jew, and this takes place before the law of Moses. This is a patriarchal setting. Some of these names have some commonalities with the names we see in the family tree of Abraham. Buz here, he's the Buzite. He was a nephew of Abraham, Genesis chapter 22, verses 20 and 21. In fact, the Targums are ancient Aramaic versions of these Old Testament books. They're part translation, part commentary, sort of a paraphrase. They were used in the synagogue a lot. But anyway, the Targum of Job actually identifies this ram as Abraham. It says that's another word for him, which we don't know if that's right or not. But the upshot is all this points us to the fact that Elihu is a worshiper of the one true God. His name, his family background, all of that points us to that fact. And his function in the book indicates that he's God's forerunner. He's defending God's honor, defending the fact that God is merciful, that God is just, that Job and some of these things he said, in his view, he's spoken out of turn, and he's preparing the way for God's appearance. But what you see in this intro here, these 5 verses, his youth and his anger, those are the two things that stand out here. There are 4 references to his anger. We saw that he burned with anger. And to be fair to him, this is a sort of righteous indignation in that he's angry at both sides. He feels that Job and his 3 friends have not handled this right. He thinks that Job, in his opinion, he's made himself out as if he's more righteous than God. He's angry at the friends, though, too, because he feels like their arguments have been weak. He may have some sympathy for the fact that they're holding Job accountable, but they haven't been able to answer anything that he said in his view. They haven't been able to contradict him in any way. So during all this dialogue, this back and forth, he's been mindful of the fact that they're older. He's a young man. In accordance with custom, he's remained silent, but now they've stopped talking, and he's angry. And so he feels like he just absolutely has to vent here. And as we said, 4 unanswered speeches. First of all, God instructs a person through dreams and through afflictions. That's chapter 32 and chapter 33. We'll definitely look at that one today. But in doing that, God is trying to turn a person from wrongdoing. The second speech, we'll get to if we have time, maybe next week, if not today. God governs the world in justice without any exception. That's chapter 34. Third, chapter 35. Humans can't affect God either by sinning or by committing any sort of righteous act. And then finally, in the last speech, chapter 36, chapter 37, he's going to return back to the theme of the first one where God disciplines people with suffering. And Actually, at the end, he's contemplating God's glory manifested in the thunderstorm, which prepares the way for God, who actually answers out of that thunderstorm, out of the whirlwind. But he concludes with that conviction that the righteous or the wise are those who fear God, which, remember, that's the whole big theme of the book. It's chapter 28. That's what the test is all about. Does Job fear God for no reason? So he's on the right track. He's just not quite right about Job specifically. But we get to the speech then, starting in verse number 6, and we got this verbose apology. I'm going to read through the whole thing here in a moment, but after that we get to the thesis that he has here. But two parts really to this speech, that apology and introduction. That's verse 6 of chapter 32, all the way down through chapter 33, verse 7. That's one of those places where the chapter divisions are unfortunate, because really this all hangs together. And then he teaches about discipline in verses 8 through 33. So let's read through this apology, his defense of his speaking here. It's a long section, but then we'll come back and talk about it briefly. Verse 6, Elihu the son of Barachel, the Buzite, answered and said, I am young in years, and you are aged. Therefore I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the Spirit in man, the breath of the Almighty, that makes him understand. It's not the old who are wise, nor the aged who understand what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. Behold, I waited for your words. I listened to your wise sayings while you searched out what to say. I gave you my attention, and behold, there was none among you who refuted Job or who answered his words. Beware lest you say, we have found wisdom. God may vanquish him, not a man. He has not directed his words against me, and I will not answer him with your speeches. They're dismayed. They answer no more. They have not a word to say. And shall I wait because they do not speak, because they stand there and answer no more? I also will answer with my share. I also will declare my opinion. For I am full of words. That's an understatement. The Spirit within me constrains me. Behold, my belly is like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. I must speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any man or use flattery toward any person, for I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. But now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all my words. Behold, I open my mouth. The tongue in my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart, and what my lips know they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Behold, I'm toward God as you are. I too was pinched off from a piece of clay. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My pressure will not be heavy upon you. So we read through this, and I mentioned him being verbose. He could have said all of this much more succinctly. It's really redundant. But we have this long defense of him getting up in the presence of his elders and speaking. Now, the practice of offering an apology like this, a defense for yourself, is well attested in ancient Near Eastern literature, particularly when somebody assumes a role that because of their status or because of their age, they wouldn't normally be assumed to take. And so what he's doing here is proper. He concedes right off the bat that he's too young to have the right to address Job. And we all know, in contrast to our modern society where things have sort of flip-flopped and we seem to worship youth and we write off older people, in most ancient cultures, this no exception, older people were revered. They were the ones who had wisdom. Those who were young, inexperienced, wet behind the ears, he shouldn't be speaking here. Wisdom is associated with the aged. So he's timid. He's afraid, but he can't be restrained any longer, and so he defends his right to speak because he's disappointed with what everybody else has had to say, the wisdom spoken by the elders. And so he concludes that, maybe there's more to wisdom than just seniority. The old aren't necessarily always wise. This is verses 9 and 10. So he believes that his opinion is valid too. They need to listen to him. And he turns then from these general statements to addressing the three friends directly. This second person, behold, I waited for your words. He listened to their reasoning. He listened to everything they had to say. And he says, not one of you was able to counter Job's complaints. And he anticipates the sort of thing that they're going to say in response. Beware lest you say, we found wisdom. God may vanquish him, not a man. He cautions them, hey, don't be overconfident in this and say that we have wisdom and let God take care of this now. Because I love verse 14. He's not directed his words against me, and I will not answer him with your speeches. That's at least a touch of arrogance there, if not more. Unlike them, he believes he's going to be the one to refute Job. He's not going to offer those same worthless arguments that they have. And you say a man can't answer him. Well, he hasn't had to reckon with me yet. Job just hasn't had to deal with a logician like Elihu, at least in his view. Now, in fact, he doesn't offer the exact same arguments that they do, as we're going to see. And as I've already pointed out, his perspective is closer to the truth than theirs is. But we know he's not quite right, because if he was right, there wouldn't be any need for God to speak. God actually straightens out some of what Elihu says. But then he turns from speaking in the second person to the third person, verse 15. They're dismayed. They answer no more. It's almost like he's been talking to the friends directly, and now he turns to Job, and he starts talking to Job about the friends. But essentially, he's just restating the same thing, the reasons that he's going to speak. They don't have anything to offer, and so he says, I also will answer with my share, verse 17. I also will declare my opinion. He actually uses even I twice here. It's not translated because it just seems so redundant, but he says, I also, even I, will answer with my share. It's just, again, sort of pointing out the way that he thinks about himself. But he has this vivid image here of his compulsion to speak. I am full of words, which, as I said, is an understatement. He's absolutely full of words, but they're just like about to burst out of him, he says, like wine in a new wineskin, that same imagery that Jesus uses in a parable in the New Testament. But he says he has to vent these things, otherwise he's just going to explode. And he's going to speak the truth without being partial. He doesn't even know how to flatter, he says. He then turns to address Job directly. That's the beginning of chapter 33. And he shows us here that, at least as far as it goes in not flattering somebody, he really means that. He's brash. Hear my speech, O Job. Listen to my words. And then you get again this verbosity. I'm opening my mouth. The tongue in my mouth speaks. Really, I have a whole lot to say. I'm just about to do it. Here it comes. Get ready for it. The impression I get throughout this whole thing, he's kind of like the fake tough guy. Hold me back. You better hold me back. And, he's waiting for somebody to actually hold him back. That's kind of what you get. Hold on. Here it comes. Get ready. Because he's trying to, work himself up, because he knows he really is speaking sort of out of place here. So he's kind of, psych himself out here, get fired up to be able to speak here. Here it comes. Get ready. And then you have this sort of, this mixture between that and this brashness, this false confidence. He says there in verses 6 and 7, hey, Job, you don't need to be afraid of me. I'm a man just like you are. You may have been afraid of God. You're worried about speaking to him. And Job's expressed things like that. He says, well, you don't have to be afraid of me. I'm a man just like you are. You don't have to worry about being overwhelmed. I'm just a man. I put on my pants one leg at a time, just like you. That's sort of the idea here. But finally, after all of that, at long last, he's ready to actually get in and make his point here in this first speech, which is the rest of it, verses 8 really down through the end of the chapter. Come on now. This thing there we go. We're going to divide it up into some little smaller chunks, though. This speech as a whole is all about teaching about discipline. That is how God can instruct people. But first of all, he's going to state Job's argument, or at least the way he perceives Job's argument, verses 8 through 11. Then he'll offer his thesis, verses 12 through 30. That is how God can use suffering to discipline people. And then finally, he'll invite Job to respond, verses 31 through 33. But first of all, Job's claim, or his presentation of Job's claim. Surely you have spoken in my ears, and I have heard the sound of your words. You say, I am pure without transgression. I am clean, and there is no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasions against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all of my paths. So he presents Job as claiming to be free from sin, and in verse 9 in particular, he chooses words that would have Job claim moral perfection. Now, I know it's been a while since we looked actually at Job's his speeches. That's been months. We did have some indications of this in his avowal of innocence. And I know also not everybody was even in there for that first part of the class some months ago. But I'll ask you this. To claim, as he does here, that Job has essentially argued that he's morally perfect, is that a fair statement of what Job said about himself? I know it's been a while, so maybe nobody has any thoughts on that. The answer is no. It's not a fair restatement. It's slightly different, but importantly different from the way Job has said it. It sounds similar, but importantly, Job has never used these words about himself in verse 9 in the Hebrew. He never refers to himself as clean. He never refers to himself as without any transgression. He does use this word pure, but he's never referred to himself as pure. He referred to his prayer as pure. That's back in chapter 16 and verse 17. What Job has stated over and over again is he's confident in his faithfulness. That is, that he's been loyal to God. He's continued to trust God and to serve God. Not that he's sinless, not that he's perfect. He's maintained that he's blameless, but that's a different word and a different concept from this here, and it's important that we maintain that difference, because when Job says he's blameless, what he's saying is not that he's perfect. I mean, he knows he's not, otherwise he wouldn't have offered sacrifices on behalf of himself and his family. But the idea is he always tried to live in accordance with God's will. He always tried to make the proper recompense when he didn't. And even if he has sinned, he's never sinned in any way that he should be punished in the way that he has been, that his suffering is not commensurate with any sort of sin that he's committed. Now, that's still a strong claim that he makes about himself, but it's important that we don't get that twisted, because it's a big difference to say, I've always tried to serve God, I've been faithful, I've been loyal, and to say, I'm perfect, I'm without sin. And that's what Elihu accuses him here of saying. So this is where he's already not quite right. But that's the way he's heard Job. It's not what Job said. That's what he's heard. Yeah, exactly. Job has never turned from God, which is one of those things they've accused him of. In fact, that's one of the great sort of tensions in the book. Glenda said, if you didn't hear, that Job has been saying he's still a servant of God, and that's right. Even in that avowal of innocence, he thinks that God has been punishing him, and he wants God to answer why, but he's depending on God to answer that. You know, he's still reaching out to God in the midst of his pain because he believes God is just, and God is going to give him some sort of resolution here. So Job's never turned from God. He does actually quote him fairly in verses 10 and 11 here, the idea that he feels God is afflicting him, and he even quotes him directly in verse 11. That is a quotation of Job. But then we have the response that he makes to Job's argument, the big thesis here, that God uses suffering in order to discipline people. And he starts off with talking about how God deals with people. We'll read it in a little smaller section. Verse 12. Behold, in this, and these statements Job's made, or at least that he perceives him to have made, you're not right. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him, saying, he will answer none of man's words? For God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from his deed and conceal pride from a man. He keeps his soul back from the pit, his life from perishing by the sword. So that's one way that he speaks, through these dreams. Then secondly, man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and with continual strife in his bones, so that his life loathes bread and his appetite the choicest food. His flesh is so wasted away that it cannot be seen, and his bones that were not seen stick out. His soul draws near the pit, and his life to those who bring death. So we'll stop there for the moment. He begins this response. Here's what Job has said in his view, and he begins with judgment on Job's approach. What you've said is not right. And what he's arguing here is that it's his complaint that's wrong. Remember, we pointed out this difference already. For Elihu, it's not some past sin that Job has committed that's causing him to suffer. Elihu admits God can cause you to suffer for other reasons, that it might be God trying to speak to you in some way. That's the whole thesis here. But for Elihu, what Job is doing wrong is responding to this suffering improperly, daring to complain against God. How can you be so presumptuous is the sense that we get here. Why do you contend against him? Job has said God doesn't ever speak to a man, but Elihu says, no, you got it wrong, man. God goes to great efforts to communicate. That's verse 14. And he says he does it in one way and in two. That's poetic. He does it in two different ways. Most prominently in visions, according to Elihu, verses 15 through 18, as we read, and then secondly through pain, through suffering, through disciplining you that way. So God speaks through visions and deep sleep there, verses 15 through 18. He reveals the error in people's ways there. He seeks to turn them from the way that they're going and turn them back to the right course. And then that second method, verse 19, man is also rebuked with pain on his bed and continual strife in his bones. The discipline of pain, God speaks to people that way. Now, obviously, that's a more severe method than the dreams. And it seems that the thought is, if he couldn't get your attention in the dreams, then now he's going to speak to you through this discipline of pain and try to, again, cause you to turn. That loss of strength is hopefully going to cause a person to wake up, to see the error of their ways. And if you respond to that, you'll avoid the pit. You'll avoid an early death. Then he talks about this angelic mediator. That's the second part of his thesis. Verse 23. If there be for him an angel, a mediator, one of the 1,000 to declare to man that what is right for him, and he's merciful to him and says, deliver him from going down in the pit. I have found a ransom, lest his flesh become fresh with youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then man prays to God, and he accepts him. He sees his face with a shout of joy, and he restores to man his righteousness. He sings before men and says, I sinned and perverted what was right, and it was not repaid to me. He has redeemed my soul from going down to the pit, and my life shall look upon the light. Behold, God does all these things, twice, 3 times with a man, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be lighted with the light of life. So Elihu says, in the midst of this suffering, there's a heavenly intercessor. And who this figure exactly is, that identity's been debated. It's uncertain. I think for time's sake, that's not even the sort of thing we want to get into. But likely in the big picture of the book, Job has longed for a redeemer, his kinsman redeemer, or a witness, somebody to come forward and to speak to him, for him, I should say. That's come through in a number of his speeches. Probably this is a response to that. Elihu says, there is somebody like this special angel, this messenger, this mediator. And somebody in God's wisdom and in his grace, there is this heavenly figure that will cause you to be restored on account of this. God makes extensive efforts, in fact, on account of his grace. He does all these things. He tries to speak to you with dreams, with pain. He has this heavenly intercessor, and he does this because he wants you to turn. Twice, 3 times. He's trying to bring you back from the pit. This is his mercy. This is his grace at work. And so because of that, this new twist he puts on Job's suffering, he offers a chance for him to respond to this, an invitation for him to answer. Pay attention, O Job. Listen to me. Be silent, and I will speak. If you have any words, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me. Be silent, and I will teach you wisdom. He exhorts Job to attend to his words. He seemingly wants to just keep talking without any sort of reply. But if Job wants to respond, here's the chance. You got something to say it now. If you don't, just keep silent, and I'll teach you wisdom, which is, again, another mark of his arrogance here. But we might think, having read through all this first part of the book, like, really, Job's not going to say anything now? Because as much as we talked about Elihu being wordy, Job's been pretty loquacious himself, so he doesn't have anything to say. But I think the point is, Job, for his part, Job's rested his case with God. Remember how he's turned throughout that first part of the book increasingly to seeking a resolution with God? We saw at the end of chapter 31, the words of Job have ended. He doesn't have anything more to say to a man as far as this goes, because he doesn't think there's any sort of answer Elihu can offer. He's not reduced to silence by Elihu's arguments. He just doesn't think that he has anything to offer him here. And so Elihu's going to resume his argument after a brief pause. But the point of this first speech, Job is wondering why God won't speak to him, why he won't explain the reason for his suffering. And Elihu's argument is that he hasn't been silent. He's speaking here all along. He's speaking in your dreams. He's speaking in this pain. He's speaking in unexpected ways, but he's trying to get you to wake up and to turn to him. And so Elihu's hope is that Job will listen to that, and he'll turn from his complaining about God, and instead will focus on his grace, on his mercy, on the fact that he is reaching out to him. So in this sense, even though his answer is not quite right, it is something that's certainly more comforting and more instructive than the friends, because he's delivering Job a message of hope here. He wants Job to be justified. He wants him to be restored. He's a little off track with Job's frame of mind, but he's at least pointing us in the right way. We obviously won't get into the second speech today. Anybody with a question or a comment or anything at this point? Okay, we'll pick up there next week. Hopefully we'll get through the other 3 speeches. The next 2 are shorter. If we don't, we'll at least get through 2 and 3 next week, and worst case scenario, we'll wrap up with that 4th one 2 weeks from now. Thanks for your attention this morning.